Thank you, Murish. And Ronan, I don't know where he is. There he is. These guys are great. They're wonderful, and I'm just delighted to be here. It's nice to be appreciated because for a long time I was not. It's a new experience for me. I am absolutely delighted to be, I just want to say also that the other speakers, and I'm not going to name them all, have been terrific, absolutely terrific today. I've actually learned a wonderful amount. I'm delighted to be back here, partly because in 1970, I think it was when I was a clinical student in Harvard Medical School, I had the idea, I wanted to escape all that stuff for a little while. It was an absolutely wonderful time. It was terrific because I had absolutely been passionate about reading the Irish writers. The Irish writers were really the ones, the Irishans and the Russians actually were the ones that I mostly gravitated to in my youth and college years. And so I read them all. I read them all, really, literally. Anything I could get my hands on. And I chose Hollis Street because 2 chapters of Ulysses are set there, and because Joyce, as all of you know, was a medical student, however briefly in UCD, and did some stuff there. And I was still drinking in those days, and I don't know what I remember, you know. I mean, I have never been so drunk in my life because we slept downstairs. I don't know, did any of you do OBGYN at Hollis? Anybody in the room? But in those days, you slept downstairs on horsehead mattresses, the guys that were doing the rotations, and I slept down there too in these little cubby holes. And every single night, they would take me out. And there used to be a pub called O'Dwyer's right across the street, you know. And every night we'd wind up at O'Dwyer's, you know, and they'd have to, I never saw anything like this before in the States. They'd push you out, you know, they had to push people out of there. And we'd get pushed out of there, and we'd be, I mean, literally, we'd be out on the street like this, you know, what is it, maybe 11:30 by the time they push you out, something like that. And I look up at this hospital, we're trying to stand up, we're looking up there at the top floor. The top floor is the delivery ward. We say, well, should we go and yank out a few babies before we go to bed? You know, it's like, and we did, you know, we did. They didn't give us the toughies, you know, they gave us, people who had 18 babies before, but we'd go up there, you know, we'd catch a baby, and we go down that rickety old elevator, and I remember the elevator on that floor that you come in, it had a virgin like stuck up against the wall, you know. Statue of a virgin, not a virgin. There weren't any virgins. No virgins in that hospital. And it was absolutely wild. And this was before the House of God. I didn't start writing the House of God till after my internship finished in '74. But things really did creep into the House of God. One of my favorite writers, I must say, is Flann O'Brien, Brian O'Nolan, right? You all know him probably. And my favorite book of his is The Three Policemen. Anybody know that book? Yeah, great book, genius. And I actually did some emergency room work and ran into the American version of those guys. They were Irish. So when it came time to write The House of God, these guys hung around the Beth Israel Hospital emergency room, right? The Jews and the Irish. I'll get to that in a minute. And so when it got to be these guys, I thought of Flann O'Brien and the 2 policemen. So I got Gil Heaney and Quick, or the 2 policemen in The House of God. And I was thinking about Jews and Irish as I was thinking about this today. And there's a exchange with Roy, the narrator, and the 2 policemen, and I think it's Gil Heaney as well. He says, the Jews and the Irish are similar in one respect. And Roy says, what respect is that? Well, in their respect for the family unit and the concomitant fucked up nature of their lives. I had such fun with that. And there is another joke, I can't even remember, but the part about the Jews and the Irish chauffeur or something. Oh, and once a year they blow the chauffeur, which is the horn for the Jews. You know, oh, that's a terribly good job, you know. Anyway, so it's wonderful to be back. It really is. So I'm going to talk about staying human in medicine. Oh, and one other thing I want to say about being Jewish, you know, the Jews and the Irish and all. I'm only Jewish on my parents' side. You know. So, staying human in medicine, I'm going to talk about one thing. Everything I've done inadvertently in the house of God, but then in all these years since, has been about this one thing. And that is the danger of isolation and the healing power of good connection. The danger of isolation, the healing power of good connection. And it's a lesson not just for medicine, as is obvious, as Deborah talked about, other people have talked about today. You know, I really, you don't know why you write, really. I just had to. But somebody asked me at the Boston Globe on an anniversary of the House of God, I think the 30th or 35th or something like that, why do you write? And I never thought about that before. I forgot what I told her, and then I saw it in the paper, and it turns out Shem writes to deal with injustice and to show the danger of isolation and the healing power of connection. So it's to deal with injustice and the healing power of connection. The thing that gets me going, like with the House of God, is outrage, right? After that, I said, this is so bad, somebody's got to write it, and the somebody is you. That was number one. And the second thing is, it's so bad, nobody's going to read it unless it, and I remember these words in my head, unless it rides on humor, right? So the first part of the book is very, very funny. And then if you look at the trajectory, it gets pretty, pretty dark. And if people try to read it during their training, they stop. They can't go on. They return to it 10 years later, and they say, oh, Jesus, you know. So that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to do the House of God, and then a couple of other things, how this has all been put together in my journey. It's really a journey of understanding something about what is good connection and how do you get there. And that's very, very important, especially in this age of dot-coms and all the stuff we've been talking about today. So, the House of God, what a journey, I must say. As I said, I was roundly hated by Harvard and much of the older establishment when it came out. And after all this time, it's gotten pretty kosher. But maybe a year or two, a few years ago, I don't know when it was, our daughter Katie was having, her class was having a potluck dinner when she was young, and it was just parents, so I'm wandering around. And I don't know who to talk to. I'm a little shy, really. And I hear these two women talking. They're doctors. Great. So I get a little closer. They're doctors at the Beth Israel Hospital, my alma mater. So I wait for a chance to break in. And I said, you know, I may not be the most favorite person at the Beth Israel Hospital, the most favorite doctor at the Beth Israel Hospital. And one of them looks at me, and with venom, she says, well, you can't be as bad as that guy that wrote that book. You know. And there's this nice silence, you know. I'm thinking, do I tell her? No, I just said, well, as a matter of fact, I am the guy that wrote that book. And she blushed beet red, and that was the last play date our daughter had with her daughter. Okay, I'll tell you a little bit. I tell you stories about the House of God. I started to write the book as a catharsis. We got the guys together, my core group, you know. We got drunk. I tape recorded some of it, and I started to write it. But I was looking for a play agent. I was writing plays in those days. And somebody told me that somebody in New York was a play agent. So I wrote a letter to the play agent, and I said, and down at the bottom, I said, P.S., I got something of a doctor novel. She wrote back, she said, I don't do plays. You're misinformed. Why don't you send me what you got of your doctor novel? Well, I didn't even know in those days you were supposed to double space. This was typewriter days, but a single spaced, booze, tobacco, coffee, single spaced, all scrawls all over it, maybe about 50 pages, something like that. I sent it off, forgot about it. And I was starting my psychiatric residency in those days, at that time. And about 2 weeks later, I'm standing in McLean Hospital, which is, you know, big psychiatric hospital, and the secretary said, oh, there's so-and-so on the line for you. I'd even forgotten her name. And this is the first feedback of this manuscript that would have me here 35 years later. And she said, quote, you know, I don't know if you're a madman or a genius, but I really like what you sent me. And I had the actually clarity to say at that time, well, I can't help you there, but you should know I'm speaking to you from within a mental institution at this time. So that was the beginning. Nobody wanted to publish it. I finally found a publisher. You know, I wrote 7 drafts later. I'm standing in the publisher's office. He called me in, just about to be published. You know, got a couple months to go. Called me in. The lawyer's there. He said, a lawyer? What do you want, a lawyer? And he said, well, we want to make sure that we don't get sued. We want to make sure that there's no one in the book who's identifiable. Who isn't? I'm thinking. My first novel. I never knew you were supposed to disguise people, you know. So I figure I'll give him one. So I said, well, the chief of medicine is identifiable. He's a kidney guy. He tucks his stethoscope into his crotch, and he walks down the hall whistling. We look at each other. Oh, that's bad. That's very bad. They concur. He turns back to me. He says, well, does he have a big red birthmark on his cheek? And I said, no, he doesn't. Now he does. He said, open your book, first, and I think only mention he appears, big red birthmark on his cheek, you know. That's called that's the libel-preventing birthmark. Right? But Dr. Epstein, it says here in the court, Dr. Epstein, it says here that you have a birthmark. Clearly you do not have a birthmark on your cheek. I thought that writers didn't do appearances. So I took a pseudonym because I didn't want my patients to find out that I was writing this sexy, radical book. They all found out. They didn't give a shit, you know. They wanted to talk about themselves, not about me, you know. So I didn't take any speaking gigs. I didn't, you know, the only way you could get to me was through my publisher. So one day, and I did, for 2 years, I just, you know, went on with my life, writing and practice. And then one day I got a letter from my publisher that said, quote, I'm in a VA hospital in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and if it weren't for your book, I'd kill myself. So I said, well, you know, maybe they want to hear what I have to say. And so I started. Back in probably 80, 81, and I've not stopped. And I always talk about the same thing, although I've learned more about it as the years have gone on. So that's what I'm talking about. My writing starts in outrage. I call them, hey, wait a second moments. And these are moments that you have. I mean, I even had one today. There's a guy asking for money on one of the bridges, and I didn't give him any. And I'm thinking, why didn't I give him any? You know, it's those kinds of things. Every day you think maybe I should have done something and I didn't, et cetera. And when enough of those, hey, wait a second moments pile up, I start to write. And then after 7 drafts, the anger's out of it, and it's a book. So let's look at the House of God fairly briefly. We were products of the 60s, my generation, and we learned through experience that if you saw an injustice and you got together and you took action, you could change things. What a bizarre idea. We helped put the civil rights laws on the books, and we stopped the Vietnam War. I've got the burn now, just so you know. Bernie. And so when we went into our internship in 1973, when we graduated from medical school, we really went into it very idealistically and expecting that it would be humane. And we immediately found that there was this conflict between the inhumanity of the system, the hierarchical system, and the call of the human heart. And we resisted. And if you look at, you can look at the book, you can read the book many ways. One way is as a sort of pamphlet for nonviolent resistance in a hospital. You know, we resisted. Let me read just a couple things. Well, I don't have to read it, I remember it. Read 2 things. One is true, one is a little embellished, as I'll describe. Early in the internship, the runt, who you may remember as a character, whose parents were both psychoanalysts, bad news. This is true. He sat down at the lunch table. opened up his hamburger, put a pill on the hamburger, and munched it down. And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "Vitamin, Valium V. I'm very nervous." He said, "I'm putting all my patients on it too." And I said, "What? You're putting your patients on Valium too?" He said, "Yeah, they're very nervous too, having me as their doctor." And then he goes on something about, when the yellow man, I got a confession to make. When the yellow man came into the emergency room last night, I couldn't handle it. I offered him $5 if he'd go home. He took it and left. That works, actually. The second thing is interesting in terms of writing. One of the great things about being a fiction writer is if in your life you've done something or not done something that you're kind of ashamed of and later you feel guilty about or you think, how could I have done it better? You can do it in the fiction. So this is actually a piece of the House of God. The fact was, a woman comes in sort of early in his internship, and she has metastatic breast cancer. And she's on the medical ward just to get tuned up, and then she's sent down to the surgeons to open her up, see if there's anything they can do. Well, there's nothing they can do. They bring her back up, and then they run away. And she's conscious, she's on the ward, and the nurse came up to me, this is reality, and said, somebody's got to tell her what they found. Her private doctor's not going to come in. She's your patient. And I, to my shame, said, look, I can't do this. I don't know how to do this. I was scared. And I said, I can't. And I don't know what happened. Somebody told her, obviously, the bad news, terrible news. In the book, what I do is have the fat man do it. The fat man who was really a creation, partly me, And he offers to do it. And this is the way it's described. I watched him enter her room and sit on the bed. The woman was 40, thin and pale, she blended with the sheets. I pictured her spine x-rays, riddled with cancer, a honeycomb of bone. If she moved too suddenly, she might crack a vertebra, sever her spinal cord, paralyze herself. Her neck brace made her look more stoic than she was. In the midst of her waxy face, her eyes seemed immense. From the corridor, I watched her ask Fats her question and then search him for his answer. When he spoke, her eyes pooled with tears. I saw the fat man's hand reach out and motherly envelop hers. I couldn't watch. Despairing, I went to bed. And then later the same night, he comes back from doing an admission and glances into the room. Fats was still there playing cards, chatting. As I passed, something surprising happened in the game. A shout bubbled up, and both the players burst out laughing. I still feel guilty for that, but at least I redid it in the fiction. And that's actually what I try to do is what's the best, how do you teach students how to deliver bad news, which nobody ever taught us. And that's a good primer for it. So what did I learn in the House of God? Well, it was not just a personal issue with these nasty doctors and interns. It was a systemic issue. It was a big hierarchical system with a power over system where people had power over you, and the people who were lowest down were the interns, okay? And in a power over system, what happens is the pressure comes down on the people further and further down, and they get isolated. That's the word that I'm using here. Not only do they get isolated, in the book they all get very isolated from each other. There's a suicide, if somebody goes crazy, that's all true. We got isolated from each other, but also each of us got isolated from the authentic experience of the system itself. So we started to think we were crazy for thinking they were crazy, or this was crazy. And that's a terrible place to be and to question your reality. The other thing we got isolated from, which has changed in American medicine now, because of the hours, we got isolated from everybody else in our lives. Really, the only person who comes in from outside in all of the House of God is the narrator's girlfriend, Barry, now my wife, one time, and that's it. So this is true, of course, for any subordinate group, dominant subordinate group. Right? Whether you're talking about dominance in terms of hierarchy like medicine or race, class, sexual preference, whatever. But there are, and it's summarized in Chuck's one line at the end, Chuck, the African-American intern, who says, finally he stands up to the chief and he says, how can we care for patients if nobody cares for us, right? So the house of God is a perfect example of fragmentation and isolation. There was no healing power of connection there. But at that time, writing it, I actually, without even knowing it, I put into the book some signs of that. The fat man says, and the signs are about being with the patient, being with the patient. Fat says, I make them feel like they're still part of life, part of some grand nutty scheme instead of alone with their diseases. With me, they still feel part of the human race. And Roy at the end says, the narrator, what these patients wanted was what anyone wanted, the hand in their hand, the sense that their doctor could care. So that's as far as I got then. So let's talk about connection. I mentioned healthy connection. Okay, what is healthy connection? Let me give you an example. This is called Connection 101, okay? Because people talk about connection a lot, but how do we actually do it? This is based on work Janet Surrey, my wife, and I did in the 80s in gender dialogues with men and women all over the world, 20,000 people. And we wrote a book called We Have to Talk, Healing Dialogues Between Women and Men, and it's a start of a whole new theory of psychological health and growth called the Relational Theory. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But I'll give you an example first. Think of a time when you're going out to have a lunch with somebody you haven't seen in a while, or have a meeting with somebody. It doesn't matter what. Think of that. If the meeting works, if there really is a connection, 5 good things happen, right? The first is, at the end, each person feels an increased sense of energy or zest, increased knowledge of self and other, an increased sense of self-worth and the worth of the other, an increased sense of power to act in both people. That's really important. I'll get back to that. And then finally, a desire for more connection, right? Doesn't that happen? There's that kind of click. And the opposite of that, if you think about it, is depression. It's clinical depression. It's a connection model of health and depression. And power is really interesting and very important to doctors, because the traditional Western male models of power is, power resides in this self, in this body, right? The dreaded Henry Kissinger is powerful, Trump is powerful, What this model says is that power arises in the connecting. Neither person felt powerful when they walked in, but because of the power of the connection, they walk away feeling more empowered to act. And, this makes people, speaking of medicine, this makes you a better doctor. A connection makes you a better doctor. You can take the actions that you think you could take. So the centrality of connection. Connection comes first. And that's very helpful in both in medicine and in life with your loved ones or whatever. Take a history. If you're taking a history on a patient. If you're not in a good connection, you can talk about anything. If you're not in a good connection, you can't talk about anything, right? So the issue is, can you connect? Can you connect? And a good connection is a mutual connection, right? If it's not mutual, it's not good. So what's a mutual connection? Think about it. A mutual connection is when you see the other person sees you. You feel seen by the other person, and the other person feels seen by you, right? And then the mutuality is each person senses the other feeling seen. And that's the click. That's the click, okay? And that's what we all strive for. People say, I don't have time to connect with patients, 7 minutes. You watch the good doctors do it, especially the older ones who really know their stuff. They can do it in 70 seconds, right? It's a skill. It's not a matter of time. It really isn't. But we get into thinking of I, you, rather than the we, right? This is a theory of the we. This is a theory where connection is at the center. And I'll give you an example from, let me just tell you a little bit about this theory. The usual old male, basically, measure of psychological health and growth is that it resides in the self, right? Qualities of the self. The connection model or the relational model suggests that the measure of each of your psychological health and development and growth is the quality of your connections. It's the quality of your connections. Think about it. If you're an isolated person with very few connections, that's not a model for helpful psychological growth. And so this is something we talk about as the shift to the we, and it's very helpful in medicine. Rather than staying in an IU, the example is a surgical example, actually, that I think of. Surgeons in the old days, the patriarchal surgeons, used to say, okay, I've done all the tests and I'm going to operate on you. And the patient said, okay. We've come to, I've done all the tests and you can get a second opinion if you want to. That's still the IU. IU is always adversarial. It's great for lawyers, but we're not lawyers, hopefully, you know. What's the better way? The surgeon says, well, I've done all the tests, and let's talk about what we're going to do. You insert the we into the conversation twice. Let us and what we are going to do. What happens? What's the patient going to say back to you? Try it. He's going to say, well, I think we ought to blah, blah, blah. Or I think maybe we can talk about blah, blah, blah. The word concretizes the fact that there's a relationship in the room, right? There's a relationship. It's fairly unconscious, but you shift. And what's the biggest reason that surgeons get sued? Studies have shown this, is if they don't have a relationship with the patient, okay? Let me just quickly give you an example from male-female. My wife and I, developed this theory, and we wrote about couples or men and women getting together. And we came up with 3 impasses. See if I'll tell you one, the basic one. See if it's familiar to you. Man and a woman are on a beach having a beautiful picnic lunch. They're really well connected. And the woman, wanting to feel a little more connected, says, what are you feeling, darling? The man looks around, like he's been shot or something, And he doesn't know what to say. He says nothing, just like this. And she says, can you tell me? And now there's an icy feeling from his gut that's starting up towards the middle of his chest. And just to keep a lid on it, he says, I don't know. And she says, trying to help, well, sure you do. Tell me. And now he's having this terrible feeling, terrible up around his heart, and he snaps, don't spoil it. He says, oh, I'm spoiling it, she says, right? And they're off, right? Disconnect. So if you ask men, and I was like that too. This is normal for men. If you ask men what's going on in their head when that's going on, they say, nothing good can come of my going into this. It's just a matter of how bad it'll be before it's over. And it'll never be over. There's an infinity sign, currently. Okay, you know what we called this? And I was ashamed to identify it in myself, but very relieved because I thought I was sick. It turns out to be normal with Western male upbringing. It's called male relational dread, right? And this is, once again, neither of these people felt that way at the beginning. They were in a good connection. The movement into relationship, her yearning, stimulates his dread. His dread makes her, come in further, and all of a sudden, you've got an impasse, a psychological impasse. And read the book if you want to figure out how to get out of it. Go to the website, samuelshem.com. The reason I go into that is because it's very relevant to medicine. It really, really is a shift to the we, an awareness of when you're in yourself and your ego, or when you're, it's not either or. Some men say, if I go into this relationship with her, I'll lose myself. And then you say, well, but when you're in a good connection with her, don't you feel more yourself? They go, oh, yeah. So that, think about it with your patients. you know, there's a difference between communication, which you do with a computer, and connection, which you do with a human being. Once you shift to the we, this is for psychiatry, what I learned there. Once you shift into the relationship, then you can talk to the patient about the qualities of that relationship. Instead of talking about, tell me about your mother, tell me about the qualities of your relationship with your mother, and it opens everything up. So, I want to mention briefly our play as a next step. So the we was that step, a mutual connection. Janet and I wrote a play together, just about killed us. We wrote the gender book and the play at the same time. A play called Bill W. and Dr. Bob, about the relationship between the two men that led to the founding of Alcoholics Anonymous in Akron, Ohio in 1935, and their wives that led to the founding of Al-Anon family groups. How many people know about AA in the room? You've heard about it anyway. Yeah. I will reveal that I have been in recovery for 26 years. I think I sort of didn't want to go on in the Hollis Street way for too much longer. The important thing about this play, why I'm mentioning it here today, is two things. One, Bill was a stockbroker in New York about to die, a real genius. Dr. Bob Smith was a surgeon in Akron, Ohio, about to die. He was addicted to both what he called goofballs, which were barbiturates, and alcohol. He used to go into the operating room high as a kite, you know. He didn't know what to do. He was about to die. And by this incredible series of events, the two men meet in Akron, and Bob is totally hungover from the night before. He said, I'll give you 15 minutes. I'll give you 15 minutes. He never met Bill. They talked for 6 hours, and that's how AA was founded. And that meeting is replicated, you know, hundreds of thousands of times all over the world. The interesting thing here is that what Bill discovered was that the only thing that could keep a drunk sober was telling his story to another drunk. He had to make a connection with the other drunk. Isolation, alcoholism, some of you may have heard, is called the disease. Alcohol is the disease of isolation, because at the end you're just there with your bottle. People don't even go out to drink, you know. And the treatment is connection, is good connection with another alcoholic and with something outside yourself. At one point, people think AA is about God. Neither of these men believed in God at the time, the traditional God. They tried it, it didn't work. And one day somebody came to Bill, an old friend, and he said, damn it, you big lug, you don't have to believe in God. You just have to admit that you're not God, so that something outside that self can take hold. Right? It's a program of physical, psychological, and spiritual elements, not religious elements, spiritual elements. And it has to be, they found out it has to be treated in all three arenas, which is the birth of the holistic movement in America in 1935. We came to believe, writing this play, it's been done off-Broadway now 3 times, it's gone all around. We're trying to get it done here in Dublin. When Dr. Bob met Bill, and Bill said, you know, my doctor in New York said maybe it's an allergy, like a disease. And Bob immediately perks up and he says, a disease? What? With signs and symptoms, a course and a progression, implying what? A treatment? And so he reframed it in terms of a treatment. He tried everything. As he said, I tried everything, even that crazy son of a bitch Freud, you know. He loused me up, telling me it was all in my toilet training, you know. It's a line from the play. I don't know, he probably didn't say it. But, so that medicine plays a big part in that. And we have found medical students and doctors don't know much about alcoholism, really, and they know less about AA. So that's my service in AA, is this 25 years with this play. Okay, I'm going to end with let me just think here for a minute. Let me say a word about, I want to refer back to what John and Joel and others were saying. I was fascinated by both those talks. John's talking about The Four Faces of the Buddha, was that it? And you were talking about how artists, every once in a while, an artist and a writer, I think we call an artist, I call it being tapped on the shoulder by the muse. And in 1986, when Janet and I came across both of these stories, of the biographies of these two guys, this incredible story, we sat there on a rock near the Atlantic Ocean, and we both saw the play immediately, like we were tapped on the shoulder. It was this moment. I bring it up because I'm validating those rare moments when those four things come together, and they all came together. We immediately saw it had to start with a guy up on stage. It had to be a play, because AA meetings are, person to person. Guy stands up, my name's Bill W., and I'm an alcoholic. At a time like this, I wish my partner could be here. He's talking to the audience. And he says, and on the other side, Dr. Bob, alcoholic, good to be here sober. And they start to tell their stories at these meetings, and then the play shows their stories, and then it ends with the completion of their stories. So it had this wonderful Greek tragedy structure, although it's not a tragedy, they did found AA, but you know what's going to happen, it's how it happens. So that's what happens at the best. It happened with the House of God, it happens with all my writings, and much to Janet's dismay because I go into this crazy state. It's a zone, and I think we could maybe talk about this. I don't know if there's not time now, it's a whole other dotMed session. I'm quite concerned about what John was saying was terrific, but I'm at NYU Med now, and I did a little survey of how much of the experience. They wanted me to do the House of God then and now, and I didn't know anything about now, so I surveyed the interns in Boston and New York. And one of the things I asked them about their shifts is what's the percentage of time they spend in front of a screen in their shift? Any guesses? The minimal percentage that anyone said out of 100 people. 25? Do I hear what? Didn't hear it. Minimum 80%. Minimum 80%, some 90%. And they don't like it. So that's a big issue. And the other little piece of information because of Bill and Bob, we also are concerned with the epidemic of binge drinking on college campuses, which has increased 100 times in the last 10 years. 2,000 students now in America die every year of alcohol and alcohol-related events. 5 died today. So why has it increased? It used to be 200. Why has it increased in the last 10 years? We think it's because this is the first screen generation. They did their mostly cross-gender relating across their screens, with whatever it was at the time. Our daughter's one of them, And so what happens is they are not practiced in the skill of face-to-face dealing with, the other gender very much. I remember the first time I had to ask a girl out, are you kidding? I would rather have died on the spot. It's very hard. So they go off to college, they're in dorms with them, kind of, and then in order to deal with the social anxiety, they get loaded in their rooms on vodka or gin before, and then they go to the parties. It's really, and so there are downsides to what's going on here, and I hope we'll work all of them out. And as Joel said, it's all about capitalism and the people making money, whereas we doctors once again have to take control of what we went into this for. We didn't go in this to check boxes. We went in to help people mostly. You can't make much money at it in the States anymore, So you got to do it for the love of the thing. Okay, The Spirit of the Place is my most recent book, not published in the United Kingdom, alas. This was also a step forward for me because it's really about the spiritual side of all this, but it's a very simple story. As I said, in fiction, you can do things you can't do in your life, right? So this is a story of a 40-year-old divorced doctor from New Jersey who's running all around the world in Médecins Sans Frontières. And he winds up in Italy, beautiful Italy, at one of the lakes with a beautiful, sexy, smart, funny, Italian yoga teacher. No, you can't do that in life, right? I write about it. And he's happy for the first time after this horrible divorce. He's childless. And he gets a letter when they're in Italy. It's 2 weeks late because they can't find him. His mother's died, and he has to come back to settle some of the terms of the will. He needs money. He has to go back. And he goes back to this town he despises. It's a terrible town. It's been anti-Semitic. It's very much like my town. And he winds up staying, and he joins this old doctor who got him into medicine as a partner. And the terms of his mother's will is that he has to live in her house in the center of town for a year and 13 days continuously, or he doesn't get a dime. And it's a rather formidable estate. And he doesn't want to, but he does. You have to read the book to see why and how it plays out. But so while the review said that while the house of God is what you read when you're learning to do it, this is what you read to learn how to do it in a community. And this is imagined autobiography. I always wanted to do this, but I couldn't do it, so I wrote it. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to read something that was true and then I'm going to read something that I elaborated. So the guy that he joins practice with is called Dr. Bill Starbuck. I started this book before there was a Starbuck, actually. It turns out it's an old Nantucket name that then some of those people came to this town and started whaling, a whaling industry in the town. So Bill's, this is in Bill's office. And this guy, this is, one of the things you can do in fiction is if you love somebody, you can write about him. He's dead now. And the doctor's name is Orville Rose. Ushering Orville in, Bill's hand was on his shoulder. As always, Bill was a toucher, a great toucher. You might forget what he told you was wrong with you or what he was going to do about it, but you remembered that touch. Hours later, the place he'd touched still felt special, warm in winter, cool in summer. Good to see you, son, Bill said, settling in behind a big cluttered desk and another yes smoking sign. His words came out in a calm, deliberate way, with significant torsion of his lips, as if each word were being molded as delicately as an egg and required care to survive. His greeting blew the scent of fresh scallions at Orville. Bill's other addiction, besides nicotine, was fresh scallions. When in season, his rural patience kept him supplied. And then it goes on. As a teenager embarked for a course of rank failure, his grades mediocre, too short and chubby and slow to make sports teams and too pimply to get a girl, and shy to get a girl, when he refused to talk with his parents or sister about anything close to his heart, he was sent to Bill for advice. This is all true of me. Bill never gave any advice. He sat and smoked and told stories of the 14-point buck on the wall and the gunslinging doctor and the stirrups and what was left in the safe. The summer after a desolate sophomore year, when Orville was bored half out of his mind and depressed out of the other half, Bill began to take him around with him, let him help out in the office. Orville had been enthralled by the realness of doctoring. Oh, and then he took him around for other house calls out in the county. Orville had been enthralled by the realness of doctoring, the intense contact with people at the crucial times of their lives that often helped them heal. Coming out of a family where nothing much ever seemed to take place, it was incredible for the boy to see that things actually happened in life, actually got done. Have I ever felt more at peace, Orville wondered, than in the dawn light alongside Bill in his black caddy on the drive home from delivering a baby somewhere out in a God-forsaken shack in the middle of nowhere. This man had grown him up. And then as he's leaving, Bill, thinking he's going to go back to Italy, yeah, well, there are a lot of rumors here, Bill said. The only person who really knows what's going on around here is me. People tell the truth in here. A fellow like me gets to lift up the lid, peek in under the edge, see past the bullshit. And that's one of the, well, I'll read you just a little, the end of that. Bill coughed hard and had trouble catching his breath. Orville recognized the wheeze and gurgle of congestive heart failure. Got my nitros right here, Bill said. He took out a pill box, fumbled, and spilled all the pills onto the floor. Bill stared down at them as if they were lost in the deep. He tried to bend down but couldn't. Orville squatted and searched them out, one by one, on the worn linoleum. He was hit hard by the sight of those pointy-toed Italian shoes now tattered and scuffed, and where one trouser cuff had ridden up the signs of congestive heart failure. And so then he bends down, picks them up, and then at the end he says, that he thought that would be the last time he'd see this dear old man. And then this book is a love story. Every book has to be a love story, really, for me. And this didn't happen. But I think it's based on things I wanted to happen in a lot of ways. And when it came time to write this, it's once again, the muse takes over. I don't know where this is just seen that I don't know where it came from. He has fallen in love, and you'll have to buy the book to find out with whom, but it makes sense. And they've just had their first sexual experience in the winter. His beeper roused him at 2 a.m. The delivery ward, something urgent. Miranda hardly stirred as he rose and searched out his clothes and nuzzled her goodbye. The nurse had paged him for a delivery of twins. He'd been tending the couple through the pregnancy, her first. They were poor and black, a man and woman he'd known vaguely as a girl and boy. Bill had never bothered with insurance, and by this time Orville had also given up dealing with that. This was charity. There's something wrong, the night nurse was saying. Come quick, when he got there. He explained that he'd have to do an emergency. Oh, wrong big time, he realized. The tap of death on a baby's shoulder. He explained that he'd have to do an emergency C-section. The couple agreed. He scrubbed in fast and did the section. Twin boys. One was well-formed, robust, squalling. The other was microcephalic, its head the size of a doll's, but with lips and nose and eyes crammed together and with no forehead, giving it a frog-like look. Trunk and legs normal, but for a remnant of tail. It was horrible to see it transfixing, like something you'd see in a bottle of formaldehyde in a medical museum. The nurse took the healthy baby to the father, leaving Orville to wait for the other to die. Luckily and quietly, by the time he had gotten done with closing the groggy new mother's abdomen, it did. Orville went out to the father. He was still holding the healthy baby in that awkward way that new fathers do. The nurse had told him the other had died. What happened? The man asked in shock. The other baby lived only a few minutes. It was deformed. Can I see him, Doc? Orville hesitated. The older doctor in him, the good old Doc Starbuck, with paternal sense, would have patted him on the shoulder and said, "No, son, better you don't." The younger doctor applauded his wish, though knowing that once seen it would be indelible. Orville said, "Yeah, you can, sure. I just want you to know that you'll never forget it." "Him," the man said. "I want to see him." The nurse took the healthy baby, and Orville and the father went out together to see the other son. He'd been cleaned up, so he looked better, less frightening. The father reached out a hand and touched the perfect shoulder, and then the squashed head. He bowed his own head and crossed himself. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, amen. He looked up at Orville. His eyes were wet, sorrowful. He said, "Thank you." "And you," Orville said, feeling in this man the power of facing into in a world that as a rule turned away. "I think she'll want to see him too." "Fine." The father picked up the dead baby to take him to his mother. Orville got beeped away to tend to a drug overdose from the Bliss Towers housing project and a stabbing victim from a happy household and a car crash and several Christmas specials including a shepherd from Austerlitz, sure he was picking up Radio Free Europe through a metal plate recently placed in his skull. Sounds familiar, right? Later, during a break in the action, he walked out into the parking lot and searched in his pockets for the half-smoked Perotti cigar and matches. The night was crisp. The little town was iced up, and the air tasted like cold quarters and seemed stretched tight as an eardrum, so it was like you could hear everything. He thought of the dead twin who would always be almost there, floating there like all the dead, and the live twin. He thought of Miranda, of her histories, and of their lovemaking, and he whispered out loud, "This is the one that will survive." So, you never know what a novel's about until somebody tells you. You're not thinking about what it's about, I mean, except in the most general terms. The House of God is about internship. Mount Misery is about psychiatric training, that kind of thing. So you don't really know, if you're a writer, you're just in it. Who says what next? Somebody tell me, And until somebody tells you. So for a good friend of ours said, "You know what this novel's about?" And I said, "What?" She said, "It's about a doctor who is brought against his will home to heal the town, and the town heals him." This is that kind of mutuality of connection I was talking about, because he's forced to stay there with this crazy, weird town that he doesn't like for, a whole year and 13 days. And that process changes him. And, this is sort of imagined autobiography. And I think what he discovers, really, is that happiness is not an individual matter. It's not an individual matter. Near the end of the book, it's really a book about suffering and how you get through it. At the end of the book, he hears a voice in his head when he has to make a big decision. And it's not really a psychological thing, it's just it comes to him. You ever had that experience? Just something comes into your mind. And it's not about your past, it's particularly, something comes in. And the thing that, when he has to make this choice, the thing that comes in is, don't spread more suffering around. Whatever you do, don't spread more suffering around. And then he makes his decision. And that's what the book's about. Everybody suffers. It's not optional. That's the Buddha's first noble truth. There is suffering, right? Everybody suffers. The issue isn't about suffering. It's about how we walk through it. If we try to walk through it alone, and stand tall, draw a line in the sand, which is much more the male model, if we try to walk through the crucible of suffering alone, we will suffer more and spread more suffering around. If, on the other hand, we walk through the suffering with others, with caring others, and that's where we come in, right? That's our job. We are paid to be with people at the most significant times of their life, from birth to death. And almost all of us went into medicine, whether we know it or not, because that's what we wanted to do. That's what we wanted to do. That's a very important job. It can tap into, as Deborah said so beautifully twice in her talk, kindness. It can tap into our kindness and our compassion, all of our best qualities. Now, it doesn't because of all of the things that, I don't have to go through it. You know why. So, if we walk through suffering with caring others, we will not suffer as much, and we will not spread more suffering around. And we may even come through it with more awareness and understanding, and we might even be redeemed. Thank you. Thank you.